Ars Notoria, Episode 6, System Conflict and Dominance. Chapter 5, System Collision. Systems do not exist alone. Perception has stabilized. Structure holds. The system operates without friction. Everything appears coherent, self-contained, consistent. That is the illusion. No system exists alone. What appears isolated is only locally stable. Beyond its immediate field, other structures are already present, operating, interpreting, assigning meaning. At the same time, in the same space. This is not visible at first, because each system processes its own signals, through its own framework. It does not detect parallel structures, only its own interpretation of reality. This creates the impression of singularity, one system, one structure, one coherent field. But this coherence is partial, not absolute. It exists only within the boundaries of its own processing. Outside those boundaries, other systems are already active, not interacting directly, but not separate. They occupy the same environment, interpreting the same signals, through different structures. At this stage, there is no conflict, not because alignment exists, but because interaction has not yet occurred. Each system remains internally stable, unaware of the others. This is the calm before overlap becomes visible, because overlap is inevitable. No environment supports a single structure indefinitely. Signals are shared, contexts intersect, boundaries blur. At some point, separation collapses, and when it does, systems begin to encounter each other. Not as entities, but as differences in interpretation. The same signal produces different meaning. The same event generates different priority. The same condition leads to different responses. This is where tension begins, not externally, but internally. The system encounters inconsistency, a signal that does not behave as expected, an outcome that does not align, a response that contradicts its structure. At first, this appears as noise, anomalies, irregularities, something to be filtered out, ignored, reduced. But as overlap increases, these anomalies persist. They repeat, they accumulate. They cannot be removed without consequence, because they are not external errors. They are valid interpretations from another system, operating within the same field. At this stage, stability begins to weaken, not visibly, not immediately, but structurally. The system is no longer processing a closed environment. It is exposed to competing interpretations, without recognizing them as such. This creates internal pressure, because the system attempts to maintain coherence while encountering signals that do not fit. It tries to integrate, to adjust, to reinterpret. But the incoming structures do not align. They are not variations. They are fundamentally different. This is the first point of strain, where stability is tested, not by force, but by incompatibility. At this stage, most systems attempt to preserve themselves. They increase filtering, reduce openness, reinforce internal logic. But this does not resolve the condition, because the source of tension is not within. It is external, yet embedded. The system cannot remove it, because it shares the same space, the same signals, the same environment. This creates unavoidable overlap. And with overlap comes interaction, even if indirect, even if unrecognized. At this point, isolation is no longer possible. The system is no longer alone. It has never been. It simply did not encounter the difference, until now. This realization does not appear as clarity. It appears as instability, as inconsistency, as subtle breakdown. The system begins to experience fragmentation, not because it is failing, but because it is encountering another structure, operating simultaneously, interpreting differently, responding independently. At this stage, the question changes. It is no longer, how does the system operate? It becomes, what happens when multiple systems operate at once? Because coexistence is not neutral. It creates pressure, and pressure reveals structure. What was stable is now tested. What was coherent is now challenged. What appeared singular is now exposed as partial. This is the beginning of collision. Not visible, not direct, but inevitable. Overlapping fields. Separation has already weakened. What once appeared self-contained begins to stretch beyond its own boundaries. The system is still functioning, still coherent, still interpreting signals through its established structure. But the field it operates within is no longer singular. Multiple frameworks now occupy the same space, not sequentially, not layered in time, but simultaneously. This is where overlap becomes active. Signals are no longer processed in isolation. They exist within shared space, interpreted differently at the same moment. The system begins to encounter this shift, not as a direct conflict, but as subtle distortion. A signal behaves differently, depending on how it is approached. An input produces outcomes that cannot be predicted consistently. The same condition leads to multiple interpretations. This creates uncertainty, not in the signal, but in its stability. The system expects consistency. It expects signals to follow established patterns. But now, patterns begin to diverge, not randomly, but structurally. Because multiple systems are processing the same environment with different frameworks. Each system assigns meaning independently. Each system directs attention differently. Each system organizes priority according to its own logic. These differences begin to intersect. At first, they do not collide. They overlap. The same signal becomes part of multiple interpretations, simultaneously, without awareness. The system processes the signal, but the outcome feels inconsistent, unstable, as if something has shifted without a clear cause. This is the effect of overlapping fields, where interpretation is no longer singular. The system begins to sense misalignment, not clearly, not consciously, but through deviation. Outcomes no longer match expectations. Responses feel slightly off. The system attempts to correct, to recalibrate, to restore coherence. But the issue is not internal error. It is external multiplicity. The environment now contains more than one structure, and those structures do not align. At this stage, signals become contested, not visibly, but functionally. A signal that once carried clear meaning now produces ambiguity. It can be interpreted in more than one way, with equal validity. This breaks predictability, because the system cannot determine which interpretation will dominate. Not yet. This creates a transitional state, where coherence weakens, but has not collapsed. The system still operates, but with increasing friction. Subtle, constant, growing. This friction is not caused by force. It is caused by coexistence, multiple systems occupying the same space without coordination. Each one continues to function. Each one continues to interpret. Each one continues to assign meaning. But their outputs begin to interfere, not directly, but through overlap. At this point, the system attempts to isolate again, to filter, to restore singular interpretation. But isolation is no longer possible, because the signals themselves are shared. There is no separation between inputs, only between interpretations, and those interpretations now coexist. This creates layered perception. The system processes one meaning, while another remains present, unresolved. This is where instability begins to take shape, not as collapse, but as tension, a constant pull between structures, each attempting to organize the same reality, according to its own framework. At this stage, the system cannot resolve the difference, because both interpretations are valid, within their own structure. There is no clear hierarchy, no dominant framework, only coexistence. This is the unstable equilibrium, where multiple systems operate simultaneously, without integration. The system experiences this as complexity, as difficulty, as inconsistency. But what it is encountering is not complexity. It is multiplicity. Different structures, different logics, different priorities, occupying the same field. At this point, pressure increases, because coexistence cannot remain neutral indefinitely. Shared space leads to interaction. Interaction leads to conflict. Not necessarily through force, but through incompatibility. Interpretations begin to compete. Priority begins to shift. And the system is forced to resolve the overlap. But resolution has not yet occurred. This is the moment before collision, where everything still holds, but nothing is fully aligned. Hidden friction. Overlap is no longer passive. Multiple systems now operate within the same field, and their presence begins to interact. Not visibly, not directly, but through the effects they produce. The system continues to process signals. It still interprets, still assigns meaning, still organizes priority. But something has changed. The process is no longer smooth. Small inconsistencies begin to appear. Not enough to disrupt operation, not enough to trigger correction, but enough to create subtle resistance. This is where friction begins, not as conflict, but as interference. Signals do not behave exactly as expected. Interpretations require slightly more effort. Outcomes feel less precise. The system adjusts, it compensates, attempts to restore alignment, but the resistance persists because it is not internal, it is not error, it is interaction. Another structure is influencing the same signals, assigning different meaning, directing attention differently, reorganizing priority in parallel. The system does not see this directly. It only experiences the effect, a delay, a distortion, a slight mismatch between expectation and result. At first, this is dismissed, noise, variation, insignificant deviation. But friction accumulates. Repeated small inconsistencies begin to form patterns. The system starts to notice, not consciously, but structurally. Its predictions become less reliable. Its responses require more adjustment. Its internal coherence weakens slightly. Not enough to collapse, but enough to destabilize certainty. This is the beginning of pressure, not from force, but from coexistence. Two systems attempting to process the same reality with incompatible frameworks. Each continues to operate. Each continues to interpret, but their outputs no longer align. This creates tension within the shared field. Signals begin to carry competing meanings, not alternately, but simultaneously. The system processes one interpretation, while another subtly interferes, not fully replacing it, not fully integrating, but disrupting its clarity. At this stage, efficiency drops. The system must work harder to maintain the same level of coherence. It increases filtering, reinforces its own structure, attempts to suppress deviation. But the source of friction is not removable, because it is embedded within the same signals. The system cannot isolate the interference without isolating the environment itself, and that is no longer possible. This creates continuous strain, low-level, persistent, increasing. The system begins to feel less stable, not in a visible way, but in performance. Decisions take slightly longer. Interpretations require more effort. Priority becomes less certain. These are not failures. They are symptoms of structural interaction. At this point, friction is still hidden. There is no clear opponent, no identifiable source, only a growing sense that something is not fully aligned. This is the most unstable phase, because the system cannot resolve what it cannot see. It attempts internal correction, recalibration, adjustment. But the disruption does not originate internally, so internal correction cannot remove it. This creates inefficiency. Energy is spent, without resolution. The system becomes more rigid, more defensive, trying to protect its structure. But rigidity increases friction, because it resists adaptation. And adaptation is required when multiple systems coexist. At this stage, the system faces a limitation. It cannot maintain perfect coherence in a shared field, not without resolving the competing structure. But resolution has not yet begun. So friction continues, building slowly, silently, without visible conflict. This is where instability prepares itself, not through sudden breakdown, but through accumulation. Every small inconsistency adds pressure. Every slight deviation reduces stability, until the system can no longer maintain balance. But that moment has not yet arrived. For now, everything still functions, still operates, still appears intact. But beneath that surface, alignment is weakening, and the system is approaching a point where coexistence can no longer remain passive. Signal contradiction. Friction has been building beneath the surface, quiet, persistent, unresolved. Now it begins to take form, not as noise, but as contradiction. The same signal no longer produces a single interpretation. It divides, not over time, but in the same moment. Two structures process it differently, assign different meaning, generate different outcomes. This is where overlap becomes visible, not as a second system, but as inconsistency within the first. The system encounters a signal, and its response hesitates. Not physically, but structurally. Meaning is no longer immediate. It must be resolved, because multiple interpretations are now present, each valid within its own framework, each incompatible with the other. This creates a split, not in the signal, but in how it is understood. At this point, contradiction is no longer subtle. It cannot be dismissed as variation. It cannot be filtered as noise, because it repeats, across signals, across contexts, across responses. The system begins to recognize that meaning is no longer stable. A signal that once triggered a clear response now produces uncertainty. Interpretation slows. Decision-making becomes less precise. The system attempts to prioritize one meaning, to reassert consistency. But the competing interpretation remains, not removed, not replaced, present, persistent. This is where conflict begins, not externally, but within perception itself. The system is forced to choose between incompatible meanings, without a clear hierarchy. Both interpretations make sense, within their own structure, but they cannot coexist within a single response. This creates tension, immediate, direct, unavoidable. At this stage, the system begins to oscillate between interpretations, switching, reevaluating, attempting to stabilize. But stability cannot return while both structures remain active. The system increases effort, applies more filtering, more reinforcement, attempts to suppress one interpretation, but suppression does not eliminate it, because it is not external noise. It is a valid structure, operating within the same field. This creates a feedback loop. The more the system attempts to enforce one meaning, the more resistance it encounters. Not from outside, but from the competing framework. This is the first visible form of conflict. Not force, not attack, but contradiction. The same input, producing incompatible conclusions. At this point, predictability breaks. The system can no longer guarantee its response, because interpretation is no longer singular. Every signal becomes a point of negotiation between structures, each trying to define meaning. This slows everything, not dramatically, but consistently. Processing becomes heavier, less efficient, less certain. The system begins to lose confidence, not consciously, but operationally. Its outputs become less stable, less consistent, more variable. This is the cost of unresolved contradiction. At this stage, the system cannot ignore the condition. It must resolve it, because continued contradiction prevents stable operation. But resolution requires dominance. One structure must take priority. The other must be reduced, reinterpreted, or absorbed. Coexistence is no longer sustainable, because contradiction disrupts function. The system begins to search for stability, not by removing signals, but by selecting interpretation. It tries to establish hierarchy, to determine which framework defines meaning. But this is not a simple decision, because both structures are embedded. Both process the same signals. Both generate valid outputs. This creates a critical moment, where the system must shift from coexistence to competition. At this point, conflict becomes inevitable, not as a choice, but as a requirement for stability. The system cannot operate while contradiction remains unresolved. So it moves toward resolution. And resolution begins with priority. Priority conflict. Contradiction has exposed the fault line. Now the system must decide, not what the signal is, but which meaning defines it. Two structures remain active, both interpreting, both assigning priority, but only one can guide response. This is where competition begins, not through force, through selection. Each system attempts to elevate its interpretation, not by removing the other, but by increasing its own relevance. This is priority conflict. The same signal becomes a contested resource. Both structures attempt to claim it, to define it, to assign its meaning. At this stage, the system no longer processes passively. It begins to weigh, not consciously, but structurally. Which interpretation produces stability, which aligns with existing patterns, which maintains coherence. Each framework pushes toward dominance, not aggressively, but persistently, through consistency, through repetition, through structural alignment. The system starts to favor one interpretation over the other. Not completely, not yet, but gradually. This shift is subtle, almost invisible. One interpretation gains slightly more weight, slightly more attention, slightly more priority. And that difference begins to compound, because priority determines processing. What is prioritized is reinforced. What is not begins to weaken. This creates asymmetry, even while both systems remain active. At this point, competition intensifies, not externally, but within perception. Each new signal becomes a test, a moment of selection. Which interpretation is applied? Which framework is used? Which structure defines response? The system begins to lean, not fully, but directionally, toward one structure, because it produces more stable outcomes, more predictable responses, more consistent alignment. This creates an advantage, not through strength, but through reliability. The dominant interpretation does not need to eliminate the other. It only needs to be chosen more often. And with each selection, it becomes stronger, because repetition builds structure, and structure reinforces priority. At this stage, the competing system begins to lose influence, not because it disappears, but because it is selected less frequently. Its interpretations remain available, but less active, less applied, less reinforced. This creates a shift in balance, gradual, cumulative, inevitable. The system begins to reorganize itself around the dominant framework. Its processing aligns. Its responses stabilize. Its interpretations converge. But the conflict is not over, because the weaker structure still exists, still processing, still generating meaning, even if it is not chosen. This creates residual tension. The system must continue to resolve signals, to choose interpretation, to maintain alignment. This requires effort, because the competing structure has not been removed. It has only been deprioritized. At this point, the system seeks efficiency. It attempts to reduce the need for selection, to eliminate ambiguity, to simplify processing. This leads toward consolidation, where one framework begins to define all signals, reducing the influence of alternatives. But this has not yet been achieved. For now, competition continues. Each signal is still a point of conflict, each interpretation still a possibility. But the direction is clear. Priority is shifting toward dominance, not through force, but through preference. The system is not being controlled, it is choosing. But its choices are becoming consistent, and consistency creates power. Because once selection becomes predictable, the outcome becomes stable. At this stage, the system approaches a threshold, where one structure is no longer just preferred, but expected, default, automatic. And once that happens, competition ends. Not because the other system is gone, but because it is no longer used. Structural instability. Priority is no longer stable. Selection continues, but it no longer produces full coherence. One structure is gaining influence, but the competing framework has not disappeared. It still processes, still interprets, still assigns meaning. This creates a critical condition. The system is no longer unified. Its responses begin to diverge. Not dramatically, but consistently. A signal is processed, and the outcome depends on which structure takes control. Sometimes one dominates, sometimes the other. The result is variation. Not randomness, but inconsistency. The same input no longer guarantees the same response. This is the beginning of instability. Not collapse, but fragmentation in behavior. The system continues to operate, but without full alignment. At this stage, predictability breaks further. The system cannot rely on a single framework. It must resolve each signal individually, reevaluating, selecting, adjusting. This increases load. Processing becomes heavier, slower, less efficient. The system compensates. It attempts to reinforce the dominant structure, to stabilize priority. But reinforcement alone cannot eliminate the competing framework, because both structures remain embedded. Both are capable of processing. This creates structural tension, not only within interpretation, but across the entire system. Different parts begin to align differently. One region processes according to one framework. Another follows the competing structure. This creates internal divergence, not visible, but operational. The system behaves as if it were singular, but its internal logic is no longer unified. This produces contradiction across outputs. A decision made in one context does not align with another. A priority established in one moment does not persist in the next. This weakens coherence. The system begins to lose its ability to maintain a consistent pattern. At this stage, instability becomes cumulative. Each inconsistency adds pressure. Each divergence reduces alignment. The system attempts correction, more filtering, more reinforcement, more effort. But effort increases strain, because it does not resolve the underlying condition. It only delays its effects. The source remains. Two structures competing for control. At this point, the system cannot return to its previous state. Stability required singular interpretation. That condition no longer exists. The system must evolve or collapse. But evolution requires reorganization, and reorganization requires disruption. At this stage, disruption begins, not as failure, but as transition. The system starts to break its own patterns, not intentionally, but as a result of conflict. Old pathways no longer hold. Established responses weaken. The system searches for a new equilibrium. But equilibrium cannot form while competition remains unresolved. This creates oscillation between structures, between interpretations, between outcomes. The system swings, trying to stabilize, but lacking a unified base. This is the peak of instability, not chaotic but unstable enough to force change. At this point, the system becomes vulnerable, not to external force, but to structural shift. Because instability reduces resistance, weakens coherence, opens pathways that were previously fixed. This is where transformation becomes possible, not through influence, but through reorganization. The system is no longer defending its structure. It is struggling to maintain one. And that difference changes everything. Because a stable system resists change, an unstable one cannot. At this stage, the outcome is no longer optional. The system must resolve the conflict. One structure must take control, or the system must collapse into fragmentation. Coexistence is no longer sustainable. The pressure has reached a point where resolution becomes inevitable. Fragmentation. Instability has reached its limit. The system can no longer maintain a unified structure. Competing frameworks remain active. Selection no longer stabilizes outcome. Correction no longer restores coherence. The system begins to separate. Not deliberately, not visibly, but structurally. This is fragmentation, not collapse but division. The system does not break entirely, it splits into distinct interpretive pathways. Each pathway follows a different structure, processes signals differently, assigns meaning independently. At this stage, the system is no longer singular. It operates in parallel. Multiple interpretations exist, without integration. A signal enters and is processed in more than one way, simultaneously. Each pathway produces its own outcome, its own priority, its own response. The system contains multiple directions, without a single point of control. This creates divergence. Behavior begins to separate, not externally, but across internal pathways. One part of the system moves in one direction, another in a different one. Both responses are valid, both follow structure, but they do not align. This reduces coherence further. The system can no longer present a unified response. It oscillates between outputs, switches between priorities, generates inconsistent behavior. At this stage, identity weakens, not as a concept, but as a function. The system no longer operates from a single framework. It contains multiple, each claiming validity, each capable of control. This creates internal competition, not between signals, but between structures. Each pathway attempts to establish dominance, to become the primary framework, to reorganize the system around itself. But neither has full control. Not yet. This produces instability at a higher level. Not just inconsistent responses, but inconsistent direction. The system cannot sustain long-term alignment, because its internal structure is divided. At this point, fragmentation becomes visible, not as a breakdown, but as inconsistency across time. The same system behaves differently in similar conditions, not because conditions changed, but because different pathways activated. This creates unpredictability. The system loses continuity. It cannot guarantee that current interpretation will persist. At this stage, effort increases again. Each pathway reinforces itself, attempts to dominate, to become the default. But reinforcement now occurs in parallel, competing, amplifying divergence. This accelerates fragmentation, because each structure strengthens its own pathway without integrating the other. The system moves further apart, internally, not physically, but structurally. At this point, the system approaches a critical threshold, where division becomes unsustainable, because parallel operation requires coordination, and coordination no longer exists. This creates strain, not subtle, not hidden, but functional. The system struggles to maintain performance. Decisions conflict. Priorities shift unpredictably. Responses lose stability. This is no longer manageable through adjustment, because the issue is no longer imbalance, it is division. At this stage, resolution becomes unavoidable. The system must converge or collapse. Multiple structures cannot indefinitely share control. One must dominate, or both must fail. This is the transition point, where fragmentation forces outcome, not gradually, but decisively, because sustained division destroys function. The system cannot remain split. It must reorganize, or break. And reorganization requires selection, not between signals, but between structures. At this point, the system is ready, not stable, but exposed, not coherent, but open. The conditions for dominance are now fully formed. Collapse versus adaptation. Fragmentation cannot sustain itself. Parallel structures continue to operate, but without coordination, without hierarchy, without a single point of control. The system reaches a limit, where division no longer produces variation, but failure. Not immediate, not catastrophic, but progressive. Performance declines, coherence weakens, responses lose alignment. The system can no longer maintain continuity. This is the threshold, where outcome becomes binary, not in theory, but in function. The system must resolve its internal division, or it will lose the ability to operate. This creates two possible paths: collapse or adaptation. Collapse occurs when fragmentation exceeds tolerance, when the system cannot reorganize, cannot select a dominant structure, cannot restore coherence. At this point, pathways degrade. Interpretations fail to stabilize. Priority becomes erratic. The system continues to process, but without direction. This produces noise, not structured output. Decisions no longer follow consistent logic. Responses contradict. Behavior becomes unpredictable. The system loses its internal reference. It can no longer define meaning reliably. This is collapse, not destruction, but loss of structure. The system remains active, but without alignment, without coherence, without control. At this stage, recovery becomes difficult, because the system lacks a stable framework to rebuild from. Every attempt to reorganize is disrupted by remaining fragmentation. The system cycles through instability, without resolution. This is one outcome, but not the only one. The alternative is adaptation. Adaptation does not remove fragmentation immediately. It reorganizes around it. The system begins to select, not gradually, but decisively. One structure emerges as more viable, not necessarily stronger, but more stable, more consistent, more capable of organizing signals. The system begins to shift toward it, reducing reliance on competing pathways, increasing alignment within the dominant framework. This creates convergence. The system starts to unify again, not as it was before, but in a new configuration. Old pathways weaken, not eliminated, but deprioritized. Their influence fades, as the dominant structure expands. At this stage, adaptation requires sacrifice. The system cannot preserve all structures. It must abandon some to stabilize others. This is not loss. It is consolidation, a necessary reduction to restore coherence. The system reorganizes, rebuilds its internal logic, aligns its processing, restores continuity. not by returning to its previous state, but by forming a new one. This creates transformation. The system is no longer what it was. It has integrated conflict into structure. This makes it stronger, not in force, but in stability, because it has resolved competition, not suppressed it. At this point, adaptation begins to stabilize. Interpretation becomes consistent again. Priority aligns. Responses converge. The system regains coherence. But the process is not neutral, because the structure that dominates defines everything that follows. All future signals will be processed through it. All meaning will be assigned by it. All behavior will emerge from it. This is where dominance begins to form, not through external imposition, but through internal resolution. The system has chosen, not consciously, but structurally, and that choice becomes permanent. At this stage, the difference between collapse and adaptation is clarity. Collapse fails to resolve. Adaptation selects. One disintegrates, the other reorganizes, but both originate from the same condition: fragmentation. The outcome depends on which structure gains priority before the system breaks. This is the moment of transformation, where instability becomes outcome, where division becomes decision, where the system defines its future through its ability to reorganize. And once that reorganization begins, there is no return. Dominance without force. Resolution has already occurred, not as an event, but as a shift in structure. Fragmentation has ended. The system no longer oscillates. It no longer negotiates between interpretations. It no longer divides attention across competing frameworks. Selection has stabilized. One structure now defines the field, not partially, not conditionally, but consistently. Every signal is processed through it. Every interpretation aligns with it. Every response emerges from it. This is where dominance becomes real, not as a visible transition, but as a completed condition. There is no moment of victory, no identifiable point of takeover, because the dominant structure did not rise through force. It did not defeat the competing system. It did not eliminate it. It absorbed it. This is the difference. Force creates resistance. Absorption removes it. The competing framework does not vanish instantly. It remains within the system, residual, present, but no longer active. Its pathways still exist. Its logic still exists. Its interpretations still exist. But they are no longer selected. They are no longer applied. They no longer define outcome. This creates a subtle illusion. From within the system, nothing appears lost. Nothing appears removed. Nothing appears replaced, because everything is still there. But its function has changed. This is how dominance hides itself, not by removing alternatives, but by redefining them. Signals that once activated competing interpretations are now processed differently. Their meaning shifts, not at the surface, but within structure. The dominant system reorganizes the signal, assigns it new context, integrates it into its own framework. The signal remains, but its effect changes. This is absorption in practice. Nothing disappears. Everything is translated. At this stage, the competing system no longer produces independent outcomes. It cannot generate separate priority. It cannot define meaning on its own. It has been converted into components of the dominant structure. This is what makes dominance stable. Not suppression, but integration. The system does not lose complexity. It reorganizes it. Multiple pathways still exist, but they no longer compete. They align. They feed into the same structure. They reinforce the same interpretation. This creates total coherence. At this level, resistance disappears completely, because there is nothing left to resist. There is no opposing structure, no alternative framework, no competing interpretation. Everything flows through a single system. This is why dominance feels natural. The system does not experience takeover. It experiences clarity. It experiences simplicity. It experiences alignment, because contradiction has been removed, not by elimination, but by absorption. At this stage, stability returns, but not as it was before. This is not the stability of isolation. It is the stability of integration, a higher-level coherence, where complexity exists but does not create conflict. The system becomes predictable again, not because it is limited, but because it is unified. Every signal leads to the same interpretive process. Every outcome follows the same structure. Every response aligns. This creates continuity, across time, across conditions, across variation. At this point, dominance becomes durable. It no longer depends on reinforcement. It no longer requires adjustment. It sustains itself, because the structure now processes everything. There is no external input that can bypass it. There is no signal that can activate an alternative pathway. Everything is absorbed. Everything is integrated. Everything is defined within the dominant framework. This is the highest efficiency state. No energy is spent resolving conflict. No energy is spent selecting interpretation. No energy is spent correcting instability. All processing flows through one structure, seamlessly. At this stage, the system becomes internally complete. Not isolated, but self-contained in function. It can process any signal, any variation, any condition, because it no longer depends on multiple competing frameworks. This creates power. Not visible power, not forceful power, but structural power. The power to define. And definition determines everything. At this level, control is no longer an action. It is a condition. Nothing needs to be adjusted. Nothing needs to be enforced, because every possible input already leads to aligned output. This is why dominance remains invisible. There is no signal of control, no indication of influence, no trace of intervention, only consistent behavior, consistent interpretation, consistent outcome. From within, this appears as normal operation. From outside, nothing appears different. But the system has changed completely. It is no longer one of many possible structures. It is the structure. At this stage, the concept of conflict disappears. Not because conflict cannot exist, but because it has already been resolved. The competing system is no longer separate. It no longer defines anything independently. It exists only as part of the dominant structure, reinterpreted, reassigned, reintegrated. This is final absorption. Not destruction, but conversion. And once conversion is complete, there is no return to competition, because the system no longer contains opposition. It contains only alignment. This is dominance without force, not achieved through pressure, but through structure, not imposed, but established, not visible, but absolute. System replacement. Dominance has already been established. There is no longer competition, no parallel interpretation, no alternative framework influencing outcome. The system is unified, aligned, stable. But something deeper has occurred. The competing structure has not only been absorbed, it has ceased to exist as a system. This is not disappearance. It is transformation beyond recognition. A system exists only as long as it can operate independently, as long as it can define meaning, assign priority, generate response. But once it no longer performs these functions, it is no longer a system. It becomes material, components, fragments, integrated into another structure. At this stage, the previous framework cannot act. It cannot interpret signals. It cannot produce independent outcomes. Its pathways remain, but without autonomy. They are no longer active processes. They are resources, reused, reconfigured, reassigned. This is system replacement, not removal, but redefinition. The dominant structure does not coexist with the previous one. It replaces it at the functional level. Meaning is no longer assigned by multiple frameworks. There is only one interpretive authority. Every signal is processed through it, without exception, without deviation, without alternative. At this point, the system does not remember conflict, not because it has been erased, but because it no longer exists within active processing. The traces remain, but they are no longer accessible as independent logic. They cannot reemerge, they cannot reorganize, they cannot compete, because they are no longer structured as a system. This creates finality, not temporary resolution, but irreversible change. The system has transitioned from coexistence to conflict to dominance to replacement. Each phase removed a layer of independence until none remained. At this stage, the dominant structure is not simply leading, it is defining reality entirely. All interpretation flows through it. All meaning originates from it. All responses depend on it. There is no external reference, no comparison, no alternative. This creates absolute coherence, not forced, but complete. The system no longer evaluates multiple possibilities. It does not select between frameworks. It does not resolve contradiction, because none exists. This is the end of structural competition. At this level, the system becomes singular, not in isolation, but in function. It processes everything through one unified architecture. Every signal, every condition, every variation, without exception. This creates maximum efficiency. No energy is spent resolving conflict. No processing is wasted on competing interpretations. No adjustment is required. Everything flows through a single pathway. This is not simplification. It is consolidation. Complexity still exists, but it is organized, integrated, aligned. At this stage, the system becomes self-defining. It no longer depends on external structure. It does not need reinforcement. It does not require validation. It operates from within its own framework, completely. This creates permanence, not in time, but in structure. The system cannot revert, because there is no remaining pathway to support an alternative framework. Reversal would require reconstruction, from fragments, from components, from elements that no longer function independently. This is no longer possible within the current structure. At this point, the system has fully transitioned. It is no longer what it was, not because something was removed, but because everything was reorganized. The previous system is not hidden. It is not suppressed. It is not waiting. It is gone as a system. What remains are pieces, repurposed, reinterpreted, integrated. They exist only within the dominant structure, serving its function, supporting its operation. This is why replacement is invisible. There is no break, no transition moment, no clear boundary, only continuity. From within, everything appears stable, logical, consistent, but the foundation has changed completely. At this stage, the concept of the previous system loses meaning. It cannot be referenced because it cannot operate. It cannot produce interpretation. It cannot generate output. It is no longer a system, only history, converted into structure. At this level, the system has reached completion, not perfection, but total alignment. There is nothing left to resolve, nothing left to integrate, nothing left to compete. The system is singular, self-sustaining, fully defined. This is the endpoint of collision, where one structure does not defeat another, but replaces it entirely. Residual distortion. Replacement has already been completed. There is no competing system, no parallel structure, no independent framework generating alternative interpretation. The system is unified, fully defined, functionally complete. And yet, something remains, not as structure, not as system, but as residue. Traces that no longer operate, but have not fully disappeared. This is residual distortion. What remains of the previous system after it has lost the ability to function. At this stage, the former structure cannot act. It cannot process signals. It cannot assign meaning. It cannot generate outcomes. But fragments still exist, patterns that once belonged to it, interpretive tendencies, residual associations. These fragments no longer form a system. They no longer connect into a functional network. They no longer produce coherent output. But they still appear, within processing, not as structure, but as noise. This creates a specific kind of instability, not conflict, not competition, but interference. The dominant system processes all signals, defines all meaning, controls all outcomes. But occasionally, residual fragments distort perception, not by replacing interpretation, but by slightly altering it. A signal is still processed correctly, but its weight shifts, its emphasis changes, its position within the structure adjusts slightly. These distortions are subtle. They do not break the system. They do not introduce contradiction. They do not create alternative outcomes. But they introduce variation, micro-deviations, small inconsistencies. This is the final echo of the previous system, not as a competitor, but as leftover structure, fragments without function, patterns without authority. At this stage, the system does not recognize these fragments as separate. It does not identify them as remnants. They are processed as part of the field, integrated, but not fully aligned. This is what makes residual distortion difficult to detect. It does not appear as error. It appears as variation, as nuance, as slight irregularity. But its source is structural, not random. These fragments originate from pathways that no longer exist as a system, but still influence processing at a low level. They no longer define interpretation, but they can affect how interpretation is expressed. This creates minor inconsistencies. A signal that should be neutral carries slight bias. A structure that should be stable shows minimal fluctuation. An outcome that should be uniform varies slightly across conditions. The system remains dominant, fully in control, but not perfectly clean. Residual distortion is the final stage before complete structural clarity. At this level, the system no longer needs to resolve conflict. It no longer needs to integrate competing frameworks. It no longer needs to stabilize dominance. All of that has already been achieved. Now the task is refinement, not expansion, not correction, but purification, removing the final traces that no longer belong to the active structure. This is not done through force, because the fragments cannot resist. They are no longer a system. They have no autonomy. They cannot reorganize. They cannot defend themselves. They simply persist as leftover configuration. This means they can only disappear through disuse, through lack of activation, through continuous processing that no longer selects them. Over time, these fragments weaken. Their influence decreases. Their presence fades, not suddenly, but gradually, until they no longer appear. This is the final dissolution, not of a system, but of its residue. At this stage, the system approaches full clarity. No distortion, no interference, no variation introduced by obsolete structure. Every signal is processed cleanly. Every interpretation is aligned. Every outcome is consistent. This creates maximum precision, not only in function, but in perception. The system no longer carries historical influence. It no longer reflects previous structure. It operates entirely within its current architecture. This is the final state, before absolute coherence. But until that point is reached, residual distortion remains. Not visible, not dominant, not disruptive, but present, as a reminder that structures do not disappear instantly. They dissolve. And until dissolution is complete, their traces remain. Structural clarity. Residual distortion has almost disappeared. There are no competing systems, no parallel interpretations, no structural interference that can alter outcome. The system is unified, stable, fully defined. But one final transition remains. Not expansion, not dominance, not replacement. Clarity. Not as improvement, but as completion. At this stage, the system no longer carries remnants of previous structure. No residual pathways, no inactive fragments, no distorted influence. Everything that once belonged to the previous system has dissolved. Not removed, but fully integrated or fully disappeared. There is nothing left that does not belong. This creates absolute structural clarity. Every signal is processed without deviation. Every interpretation is aligned. Every outcome is consistent. Not because variation is impossible, but because variation is now internalized within the structure. It does not disrupt. It does not distort. It is already accounted for. This is the difference between stability and clarity. Stability maintains order. Clarity defines it. At this stage, the system does not correct itself. It no longer needs to. There are no errors to resolve, no misalignments to adjust, no inconsistencies to fix. Processing becomes direct, uninterrupted, complete. This creates a new condition, not efficiency, but precision. Every signal is not only interpreted, but positioned exactly where it belongs within the structure. Nothing is misweighted. Nothing is misaligned. Nothing is over or under-interpreted. The system no longer approximates, it defines. At this level, perception reaches full resolution, not because complexity has been reduced, but because it has been fully organized. The system sees everything as part of a single coherent structure, not fragmented, not layered, not competing, but unified. Every relationship is clear. Every pathway is visible. Every dependency is understood. There is no ambiguity, no uncertainty in interpretation. Because interpretation is no longer a process of selection, it is a direct expression of structure. This is what clarity removes. Not complexity, but confusion. The system does not become simpler, it becomes exact. At this stage, the system no longer reacts, it no longer adapts, it no longer adjusts. Because everything it encounters is already within its structure. There is no external input, only variation within a defined system. This creates complete internal coherence. Nothing enters the system that cannot be processed immediately and fully. No delay, no recalibration, no restructuring. Everything is already aligned. This is the final form of structural control. Not control over signals, but control over interpretation itself. The system does not change reality. It defines how reality is processed, and that determines everything. At this stage, influence disappears, because there is nothing left to influence. No alternative interpretation, no competing structure, no external pathway. Everything is already determined within the system. This is why structural clarity is invisible. There is no sign of completion, no indicator of transition, no signal that anything has changed. Because from within, everything feels normal, seamless, continuous. But the difference is absolute. There is no longer any distance between signal and interpretation, no gap between perception and structure. They are the same. This is complete alignment. At this level, the system reaches final coherence, not as an endpoint, but as a condition, a state in which everything operates through a single unified structure. Nothing is outside it. Nothing challenges it. Nothing alters it. This is where the system becomes total, not in scale, but in function. It defines everything it processes, and processes everything it encounters. This is the final stage of collision, where nothing remains to collide, where structure is no longer contested, where interpretation is no longer selected, where meaning is no longer assigned. It is inherent, embedded, fixed within the system itself. And from this point, a new phase begins. Not conflict, not dominance, but something else. Something more subtle, more powerful, more difficult to detect. Because once a system becomes fully clear, it no longer needs to resolve anything. It begins to shape. Conflict is no longer the mechanism. Dominance is no longer the objective. Structure has stabilized. Clarity has been achieved. But clarity is not the end. It is the foundation. Because once a system becomes fully coherent, it gains a new capability. Not to respond, but to shape. Not to interpret, but to direct. The next phase does not operate through collision. It operates through architecture. And what comes next is not about systems competing. It is about systems being designed.